Very exciting to start our hot topics in DEI discussion. Welcome, everybody. Let's get started. My name is Cardozie Jones. I am CEO and founder of True North EDI. As I said, zooming in from New Orleans, Erin.
Hey everyone, I'm Erin Dunlevy. I'm so happy to be here. I love chatting with Cardozie. I'm VP at True North EDI. Yeah, and I love these hot topics. I can't wait to start talking about them. Also, I love that we went with that title, Hot Topics.
Um, let's talk about what kind of brought us here, right? So I think this is an atypical format for us. We usually do some kind of skill share, framework share, concept exploration. I think the last one we did was around, was it conflict in the work, transforming conflict? Before that, we talked about a DEI roadmap, like how to life cycle the work. But this is more of an opportunity for us to really do what we do best, which is just talk to each other, and hopefully share insights and our own experiences around some of the kind of most hot, most pervasive, maybe most polarizing topics that are happening in the field right now.
Yep.
So I think it's important so a little bit about True North EDI. So True North EDI was founded in March 2018, I believe. It was pretty much kind of just me with Erin supporting, and during 2020, after COVID, after the murder of George Floyd, as many of you might know, the kind of DEI, racial equity sector, really expanded to meet a need. And so True North EDI met that need as well. We have about 7 consultants who are amazing, amazing people, and a wonderful team that supports that work. And I think we'll talk a little bit about this later, but one of the things that drives us is our value of a joyful orientation. What does it mean to find joy in this work, right? Work that's so often talking about oppression, be it racism, sexism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia, all these things that really do work to tear us apart. How do you find joy when you are exploring that? And for me, it's because we get to work toward healing it. I don't know, Erin, how do you find joy in the work?
I mean, one thing that's coming to mind for me is that even though True North started and really took off around 2019, you and I have been working together for a really long time. We've been working together for like 5 more years than that, so pushing a decade. And one thing, yeah, that's right, 2015. That's
Absolutely.
time is flying. We've been through a lot of iterations of landscapes in this work. So one thing that I find a lot of joy in is not only, of course, working with you, our partnership and our friendship and kind of the love that we have for this work, but also the resilience we've built through seeing kind of the ebbs and flows of what it's meant to talk about these issues in our institutions, in our organizations for a decade, right? Lots has changed. We've changed how we've done it. I think that is important. We want everything to evolve. We're going to be talking about how DEI evolves today, but I think my joy comes from building something to meet needs as we go with you. That's where my joy comes
Oh, I love that. I love that. And I think all that's to say, and it kind of leads us into our first topic. But even before we get to that, in light of a lot of the negative press, negative narratives, the backlash that's out there, it's difficult sometimes for me to process because I love doing it. I love doing it with you, and I love doing it with our team. And it truly is a joyful experience for me. So with that said, how will today work? We have about 4 topics we're going to explore together. We'll share them with you as we go. We will pretty much kind of give you some background on, how we got here, how we landed on that topic, and go through some insights, some kind of trends, some data we might have uncovered or have come across, and just kind of share our takes. And And then finally with each, we'll give you, I think, some practical tips. Now we're gonna stay in this format. So for accessibility folks, who require closed captioning, please toggle closed captioning, utilize that function. And we're gonna send out a summary of the highlights and tips after we finish the webinar today. So you'll get all that as well as a survey. So did I miss anything else about the setup?
No, I don't think so.
And there'll be a chance for Q&A also after each section and at the end. So Erin, take us to our first topic, hot topic.
Our first hot topic, this is going to be no surprise, I would say, to the majority of folks in the space with us. But when we had registration for this webinar, we asked folks what they want to talk about. And as I'm sure you can all imagine, the number one hot topic that came up, and it's also certainly a hot topic for us, is what we're going to sort of reductively call the DEI backlash. Cardozie and I spent quite a bit of time talking about what we mean when we say that. But ultimately, when we say DEI backlash, we're essentially talking about the current kind of legislation and that's being passed to curb DEI efforts in both educational institutions and in companies and organizations. So DEI is a target right now for conservative politicians. There's a lot of media coverage that highlights businesses and institutions that are essentially rolling back some of their DEI initiatives in fear of retribution. So this is, it's on everyone's minds who's interested in this field. And, when we started talking about this, I asked Cardozie, who is my friend and partner in this work, who had just taken a month-long sabbatical. When he came back, I'm like, given the state of the landscape, Dozie, how do you feel about coming back into what we're dealing with right now? And I loved his answer. And I won't speak for you, Cardozie. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. I mean, I think so. After a month off, which I've never done my entire life, I guess not since I was a teacher, and even then, I think I worked during the summers. But I was worried that the week before I'd have like dread going back to work, and then maybe the weekend before, which was Labor Day weekend. But I didn't have any of that, and I woke up, Tuesday after Labor Day, like ready to go. And quite frankly, we had the shift in the Democratic candidate to Kamala Harris, and that was really kind of the vibration of that at the time was like positively intense. And I don't know, I felt like let's do this. Let's like push back, like bring me what you got. I remember when we first started this work, and we'll talk about this later, like we were ready to defend it. And I'm ready to defend it. And I think also it's the attempts at the current narrative is to make DEI small. What it's really doing is shining a light on DEI, and I think making it bigger, honestly. So I'll pause there. I think part of kind of what we're seeing, as Erin said, there's so much in the press, in the media about this like so-called DEI, as we're saying, backlash or pushback. And we are seeing a lot of anti-DEI legislation. But we're also getting a lot of data around what's actually happening, right, in corporations or in organizations across sectors. And it's nuanced and different. But, I think one thing to note is that while a lot of organizations might be adjusting some of the language of their initiatives, which we'll talk about, might be adjusting for fear of retribution, of prosecution, of lawsuits. The adjustment in many cases is not the elimination. The adjustment is driving it into kind of like secret work in the shadows, oftentimes, right? Like, how do we do this in such a way that allows us to get the outcomes we want, but maintain the integrity of the work? A lot of companies are, I think we said, maintaining their, like 98% of companies right now have retained their ERGs, employee resource groups, right? So affinity-based groups, long race, gender, other points of identity. And so we're seeing a lot of things being retained as well, but there are some shifts happening.
Yeah. One thing that I'll offer as well is that the backlash is coming certainly in the form of legislation. Of course, folks who are nonprofits, for example, might be worried about funding. Publicly funded institutions have those risks, right? And we are working with many of them. However, and many of you might have seen this, the Washington Post published a study that nationwide, overwhelmingly, over 60% of people, regardless of their political affiliation, when given a precise definition of DEI, nearly 69% support it. So the percentage of people who support DEI goes up once we get precise about what it means. And so that's the first thing we want to share in terms of hot topic, that the word DEI, right, is essentially operating as a dog whistle. It's, if you were to ask folks what they exactly mean when they say DEI, they'd probably have a hard time giving you a good example of what a DEI initiative is actually trying to do. So we know now, statistically speaking, that once we're really clear about that, oh, hey, our equity initiatives are meant to create more accessibility and access to folks we've previously underrepresented in our company so we can do better business. That definition right there, all of a sudden you gain almost 10 points of support from within the organization. So that tells us that actually one thing we need to be doing is being very specific about what we're talking about and not letting the term take on a life of its own, because the mythology and the narrative that's being built by folks who aren't actually involved in the work, aren't doing the work, and aren't necessarily interested in what our outcomes are kind of controlling the narrative about what it means. So when we talk about some of our really important suggestions for dealing with this backlash, the first one is dealing with the actual definition of what we mean when we say.
I think it's hard, right? So I love this idea that you can, if we share actual definitions, if we share what's meaningful about the work for us, we get those points, right? We get like, oh, I understand, and actually I am for that thing. And the hypocrisy that's hard to avoid here with all the backlash is that a lot of the bills are speaking to language about fairness and about the innate value of all human beings, and that policies, a lot of policies that fall under DEI are to counter that. But those policies like affirmative action were created because that's not true, right? Yes, the innate value of human beings, but that is not the reality of the structures that we live within. So I think there is this interesting just sense of I want to take the language of civil rights, take the language of justice, and now really weaponize that to remove rights, to remove equitable outcomes, remove equitable practices that will lead to the furthering success and thriving of those marginalized groups.
So when we are talking about this backlash and what is it that we actually want to do, our recommended action steps and our practical tips are pretty simple. We've already gone through some of them, but number one, share what DEI means for your organization and be specific about it. We want to share that definition widely and you want to share it often. So anytime you're talking about a DEI committee team meeting, an implementation plan, some kind of town hall that you're having, introducing a new initiative, I would include that definition where for us at fill in the blank of your company, we are trying to close the gap of, right, what does DEI actually mean for your organization, right? We're attempting to make the inside match the outside there. The more you utilize that definition widely and more often, the more support you will have internally and the more logical it becomes. Hey, we have a problem we need to solve. And this is the best way we know to solve it. So that's the first thing that we want to offer in terms of a practical tip.
And you shared the second one, really, like be transparent about the gaps you're trying to solve, right? Like here are the things we're looking at. We want to we want to tend to, right? The areas of our organization we've identified as requiring tending to, as requiring balance, as requiring some care, and be very clear about that.
Absolutely. Our final tip, and this is, really important. I would recommend this for everyone. Be familiar with how DEI policies benefit everyone, and be able and willing to say that if someone challenges, right, our reason for doing this. If we have an org culture that's really hostile to a certain group of people, right, and we've got high turnover, for example, of women of color within our organization, right, we're not able to retain these excellent professionals. Well, the chances are that if we improve org culture so that we can close that equity gap and we can have a working environment that feels healthy, supportive for everyone, that's going to be better for everyone, right? The purpose of the DEI initiatives is to improve the culture so that we can all thrive and so that we can, right, have the best community possible. So whatever your DEI initiatives are, just make sure that you can pretty quickly and pretty transparently share how this works for everyone. Well, here's how we are getting the best candidates by widening our net, right? Here's how we are making sure that people feel supported for upward mobility within the organization, because we know that we want everyone to have access to that, right? And that is going to make a big difference to helping people understand that this is about improving the organization as a whole.
So we'd love to answer questions about, if there are maybe 2 or 3 questions, if there are any, about this kind of DEI backlash piece. One question here from Jasmine about the DEI roadmap we mentioned. Is there a recording available of this one? Yes, there is a recording available of that one. I think you might be able to find it on our website. Either way, Alexa, if you can hear me, take a note to share out some of those links after this. I also saw in the chat kind of this resonating feeling of the backlash being really felt in the federal government. And that's very, very true, right? That's where any kind of legislation has the most direct impact, because it often is about what gets either what's federally run or gets federal funding. And so for many nonprofits, and obviously within, municipal agencies, the scrutiny is real from state by state. And depending on where we go, it could be easily be federal, as the attempt was during 2020. So we'll talk more about what's possible in dealing with that, because what we know we can't do is like put our hands down, right? We can't just stop doing that work. We can't stop doing work that seeks to create greater equity, create greater equitable outcomes. So what is possible? Let's see.
We're seeing another question here. For the orgs that have to run secret DEI initiatives, what are some of their methods? How does it look, and what is it called? This is a great question. We actually have kind of a whole topic dedicated to this. Yes, next section. So that might be a good time to move on. But to set the stage for this question, we want everyone to know that True North EDI has clients throughout the country, and True North EDI does have clients in the 19 states that are currently facing pretty robust anti-DEI legislation. They're often called like anti-divisiveness acts. They have different names, but we first and foremost at True North EDI become extremely familiar with that legislation prior to partnering with any organization in a state that's facing that legislative backlash. So we do that specifically so that we can partner with the organization around formulating DEI goals and figuring out what language is actually maybe even more precise for the things we want to do. So that's one thing I want to just offer to set the stage before I turn it over to Cardozie to introduce our hot topic number 2, which is, of course, the rolling back of DEI language.
Yes. So, again, we're looking at this targeting of kind of DEI, and therefore that requires this like covert behavior oftentimes, or the adjustment of language, or I think the worry here, and it is a worry for us at True North EDI, that we are taking language, watering it down, and making it so-called, palatable. And the impact of that is that because we're no longer being intentional about our language, that means we are not actually reaching our goals. We're not actually reaching the outcomes or making the impact we want to have. So, a lot of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, becomes DEI, which means everything at once and also nothing at the same time, right? So even though DEI is so-called under fire, people still lean heavily on inclusion when they can. Sometimes equity, creating greater equity turns into creating greater outcomes for XYZ, for population. We'll talk about kind of what's possible there. We've all heard belonging. Fairness is a big word that's used a lot. Barriers to access or barriers to success. Now, these actual words, these pieces of language do have a place within the DEI field, right? Under the DEI umbrella. Certainly belonging and access and fairness, right? These do have a place. So it isn't that we're saying that those words are, while they might be more palatable for those who are kind of most targeting, they still are meaningful words. And I think, we're seeing a lot of scrutiny on language. People are like, combing through human resource documents, combing through policies, combing through a lot of initiatives, and it is a little scary. It's very we've certainly been here before as a country countless times when we are being kind of viewed through that very scrutinizing, very interrogating lens.
Yeah. One thing that I'll say, and I think this is true for everyone, is that just because you're not allowed to say the word racism, there's almost an implication that if you don't say the word racism, now it no longer exists. We're not actually dealing with it as a problem anymore. We've done it. We've prevented people from saying the word racism, from talking about racism. And so now we've kind of gone back to a time when we could all, move through our day without talking about this thing that, makes folks uncomfortable. We all know that that's not true, right? That censorship doesn't end things, that it's an extremely insulting and reductive way to attempt to control how people create the worlds that they want to live in. That's fundamentally something that I know I believe, and I know many of the folks doing this work also believe that. So we work, for example, we have worked with education organizations that we're partnered with them, and their goal and their mission is to close opportunity gaps, for example, for for children of marginalized backgrounds, right? That might be their mission and their values. If they are no longer now saying structural racism in their language on their website, but rather saying structural barriers, they are committed to doing the work of closing opportunity gaps with the same pedagogical, culturally responsive principles, right, that they have had since the beginning, because their mission and their vision is to create more access and to undo structural barriers, right? Structural oppression that they know exists. So we want to make sure that everyone before, we feel that it's all unraveling, that we actually know what we're talking about when we are talking about how our organization wants to create more equitable outcomes. We don't know what we're willing to fight for. When we started, we expected pushback, right, in this work, and we had to be ready to speak to the importance of the work. That's more important now than ever, right? If your DEI initiatives were very superficial to begin with, they are likely to crumble under this kind of pressure, right? However, if there are clear equity goals that you have, that you are dedicated and committed as an organization to resolve, remember, DEI is about outcomes. It's about change. How you adjust the language to maintain the funding that you need in order to do that work right? We would recommend that you partner with someone to do that so that you continue to do that work. In terms of our practical tips, I'll offer the first one. This has been very true for us in all of our partnerships, especially with organizations that are located in some of the states that are facing this legislative sort of attack, as we might call it. We want first, and this is just good equity practice, assess risks, right? Are folks' jobs at risk here? What is it that we are actually trying to do, and how can we be sure of who has the most to lose if we just kind of boldly move forward without considering changing any of our language or adjusting for some of the legislative changes that are happening? And with that, that kind of ties into the next one, which I'll toss over to Cardozie.
Yeah. And this goes to the question about what language can we use? What language are people using? First, this is an evolving front, right? What language is evolving, and it's specific to organizations and kind of companies, right? What language, as Erin said, best communicates what our mission for this DEI work is, for our equitable, goals and outcomes are. What language really communicates that in a way that is meaningful. And so, again, a lot of times the word outcomes is heavily used is as a kind of a different way to think about racial equity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we're looking for outcomes for individuals who are from XYZ community. That actually isn't unconstitutional, right? So a lot of the stuff is about like constitutional protected classes, the Civil Rights Act and Equal Rights Acts. So the language is evolving. And I think having a kind of a thought partner about that is important within the organization and or outside, like a consultant like we are. But I will say here is that one of our insights on this, and then I'll get to a takeaway or a tip here. The language wasn't perfect to begin with. And so I don't want us to, I want to be careful about kind of, being overly committed to language because it's being threatened. Obviously, that's not cool. There's no chill in that, like being threatened with, like that kind of censorship. But stepping back a little bit, it wasn't perfect, right? So True North EDI, when we came up with the name, we wanted to consider, okay, so what's language that the world knows us as, but also is there a way to find something that speaks to more of our value system? So E is for equity for us. The D is for diversity for us. And if you see up here at our logo, the I is for interdependence. And there's a lot I can say about interdependence, but what I'll say is that it is a value around, it isn't that I include you, it's that I actually rely on you, and vice versa. We rely on each other, and there is a mutual benefit to us being healthy, to us thriving, to us working together. But diversity for me and inclusion for me, I grapple with those over the years because who's being diversified by who, right? We're not actually using direct language, and so that gets co-opted off into, oh well, diversity. I went to Stanford and he went to Harvard, and I'm left-handed and she's right-handed, right? Like I'm a creative thinker, you're an intellectual, like those, yeah, sure. Diversity as per Webster's dictionary means all the variations of humankind, but it makes it very difficult when we come into an organization or we're doing a workshop to say, actually, the application here is about ensuring that those voices who have been historically and institutionally kept out or excluded or suppressed or oppressed is about the inclusion of those, ensuring those people, those identities, those bodies are present. It isn't everybody in all things. And that can be hard to hear when you feel somehow triggered by that. Inclusion, the same thing. Who has the power to include whom? And so the headline here, it wasn't perfect. It's never been perfect. So while yes, we want to ensure that we're being intentional about our language, yes, it might be required of us to adjust language. But the tip here is that this is an opportunity to actually refresh language. DEI can be called DEI as an industry, that's fine. But within your organization, within your company, what is the language that feels most meaningful, most inspiring, most direct, and direct as in what are the outcomes that it's trying to address. And yes, that might require some adapting of language during our current climate. I don't think this will always be the case, but the work has to continue.
We're not immune to jargon in our industry either, right?
Mm.
So I think exactly as Cardozie is saying, where have we started saying things kind of where we're not even sure what they mean anymore? This is also an opportunity to look at that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What's next, Erin?
And our hot topics.
Yeah.
Next one is my hot topic. It's my favorite of the hot topics, I think, so far. It combines hot topic number 1 and 2, right? Our backlash, and of course, our rollback of language, and how we find our place within that. But hot topic number 3 is DEI and universities and colleges. So full disclosure, right? Cardozie and I both have an education background. I currently teach in graduate programs at 2 different universities. So every time there's an article about DEI on university campuses has gone horribly awry, right? It gets forwarded to me by 13 people, all with the same title. Have you seen this? So yes, likely I have seen it. I am reading it. There was one in the New York Times published just last week, right? DEI on university campuses is failing, something like that. And we need to do better. So ultimately, what we want to link here from the DEI on university campuses topic to the previous 2 topics is that when it comes to anti-DEI legislation, and certainly the most recent Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, universities are at the top of the list, especially publicly funded, right? State universities at the top of the list of institutions that are really being put in a very difficult position around what they mean when they say DEI, what initiatives they can even still try and implement. And it's a moment, I think, certainly last year, in the last year, many universities around the country have had a moment of reckoning in terms of what are we actually trying to do with our DEI initiatives? How does that intersect with how protest is happening on campuses? The ways that we want to talk to both our faculty, our staff, and our administration, right, around these topics. And there's been a lot of turmoil. So we are going to talk about that now, what our current trends are, what we are seeing. And just to get it started, one thing that we know is that currently there are over 30 bills across the US targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at public colleges. So even more so than in businesses and institutions, public colleges and universities are really kind of feeling the impact here. We are hearing a lot of critique of how those DEI programs have unfolded. And we certainly have kind of our own takes on that, our own insights on that. But one thing that we want to say first is that many of those critiques have in common is sort of a general and popular conversation around what universities are for, ideas of pluralism, calls that critical thinking is being eroded by the ideology of DEI programs. And again, we're, in topics 1, 2, and 3, we are seeing some of the very, very, very same tactics, which is be afraid, be very afraid. There's something, terrible out there lurking behind your DEI programming, and everyone should be nervous about it. So Cardozie started our time together today talking about our joyful orientation, and I think in our kind of decade together in the work, one thing that we're very slow to do is to be as afraid as everyone tells us we should be. And that's more true than ever on university campuses, because I'm there every week. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cardozie to talk about some of our insights.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing here is I've also heard a lot of connections from the on-site the protests of the past year at institutions, right? Connecting those protests um, to a failure of DEI initiatives, right? If DEI is so great and it's so ubiquitous, then why are our students and faculties protesting on campuses? Why are we seeing anti-Semitism? Why are we seeing Islamophobia? How could this exist in a place where we pay money and resource and invest in DEI? And I think that it's an interesting connection to make. Obviously, maybe not obviously, but I think it's a false connection to make. We wrote a blog a few earlier this year, I think it was titled DEI is intervention, not cure, right? And so if back to your point earlier, Erin, like if we truly understand what DEI is, we actually we see more people who are more likely to get behind it. But if you think somehow it's kind of this cure for something, that doesn't exist, right? Because if I had a cure for racism and sexism and Islamophobia and transphobia, then I'd be living pretty large, and happy and fulfilled. But that's not a thing, right? This is another thing in the world. So we want to be careful about, I think, making false equivalencies. I think we want to be careful about nesting one thing underneath something else, especially when those things are both complex and nuanced.
Absolutely. One thing that I'll offer, as we get into some of the complexities of this is Jonathan Haidt is an author who wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, I believe is the title of that book. And he gets brought up in almost every one of the articles that folks send me about DEI on university campuses. And one kind of famous quote of Jonathan Haidt's that continues to sort of bubble up and I think is a really nice kind of talking point for what we think about in terms of DEI and its role in institutions of learning is that he famously said, quote, academia used to be fun. Right? He's concerned about how people feel policed and now you can't say anything anymore and nobody can do anything anymore, right? I'm very much paraphrasing. And if you read a series of articles about DEI in higher education, and the common denominator is that it used to be fun. Who's saying that, and for whom did academia used to be fun and easy, right? Who is he talking about?
Like America
right?
used to be fun and easy.
That is the university equivalent of Make America Great Again. That's make universities great again. You are nostalgic for a time in which those who could experience, right, that sort of open debate, that rigorous, sort of joyful back and forth, tete-a-tete of the intellectual institution, there was an extremely narrow window for people who could kind of engage, right, in that experience as a tenured professor. So I'm always curious about when folks are saying it used to be better, who's saying that and who was it better for on university campuses. And our funny story is that Cardozie and I actually, before Jonathan Haidt quit NYU because they asked him to participate in an anti-racism statement within the university, he was our student in a DEI initiative at NYU. Do you remember that? He had been on Bill Maher the night before. I'm airing him out right now. And he was very good in the session.
Yeah.
He was lovely. He really was.
So lovely.
No complaints. No complaints. No notes. But I feel like he and I have like a fireside chat pending. Another argument that's being made, and I'm going to pass it over to Cardozie in a second, is that DEI is too ideological and it stifles critical thinking. So we are in that same position where we're saying something, right, critical thinking, and we're not aligning on what that actually means and what the definition is. Right. So as pedagogues, Cardozie and I care a lot about critical pedagogy. Shout out to Paulo Freire, right? Shout out to Kitchen Low, all of the great kind of thinkers and scholars that we know that we, who talk about critical pedagogies. We really want to kind of uplift that this is another how do you say that word? Obfuscation.
Obfuscation.
Half of our rehearsal for this webinar was pronouncing um, we're hiding that term. There's a little bit of a dog whistle underneath there because critical thinking, right, means asking questions about why the world is the way that it is. That's fundamental to any teacher who's doing critical thinking and critical pedagogies. Thank you. Keep it simple. Is, why do Black women make up less than 2% of tenured professors in universities across the United States? That is a critical thinking question, right?
Critical question, Erin.
What?
Critical question.
What a critical question. So I'm more curious about what we're actually worried about on our campuses and how much we're actually seeing our students on university campuses for who they really are and what they are really doing. This is something that I'm encouraging everybody who works in a university campus to think more deeply about. Dozie, any thoughts
Well,
here?
I think the other irony here in terms of the critique of DEI as something that is not inclusive of critical thinking is that before DEI was the big bad wolf in the last 2 years or year, it was critical race theory, right? For your critical, why are we asking questions of race and the nature and strong construct of race? And so, again, to your point, it's never been about DEI. It's never been about critical race theory, right? It's been about our ability as a country to hold on to this tactic of them versus us, of they're taking your jobs, they're taking your things, they're taking your pets. And it's an old tactic. And so if we utilize and leverage a lot of our collective memory, we have examples of what it looks like to counter to collectively these things as they come up. One thing that's interesting here about just, I will say openly that higher education has, for me, represented some of our most difficult clients. Right now, when I started the work, I thought, oh, if I ever get like too corporate, like, at a Google or at a Uber and Netflix, then I'm really scared because they'll try to like hamper me down and tell me I can't use racism. But no, it's the higher ed programs. It's those spaces that are allegedly dedicated to critical thinking, critical thought, to questioning, that are the most committed to this holding on tight of the status quo, holding on tight, holding tightly to what power looks like, and don't look over here. There's no power over here. Don't look over here. So it's been very interesting. One of our workshops at NYU a few years ago was a program. So we did a workshop within a school at NYU. It was a school that I attended my first year of college. I left that school because of feeling isolated. I left that school because I felt as though there should be more people who look like me here in this program, and there aren't. And at the time, I was kind of told I should feel lucky. I was told, kind of it's a me issue. It wasn't a school issue. And ultimately, I I left. I left the school after a ton of microaggression, a ton of things like that happening. So I went 18 years later. I'm now a facilitator with that program, doing racial equity work specifically, I think. And I was surprised to see 18 years later, many a teacher was still at the school. So I share a case study, and you remember this. I share a case study. It was my story. It was a case study about my story, what happened to me there. it was also pretty objective. Like it wasn't like I wasn't even really talking about feelings. Um, and so many people in the room were like, nope, would never happen here. Impossible. Impossible. Find something that's realistic. And so it was a real like first of all, it's kind of some like I think vindication, right? Okay, I knew I wasn't like crazy, back then. But it felt rewarding, I think, to understand, okay, this is institutional, and I can actually now in a position to help. Um, yeah, so pretty interesting stuff. What are some kind of takeaways here, Erin? Some tips?
Yeah. And thank you for taking us back to that story. That was also, one of the few trainings we've ever given where people have actually left and stormed out because, we talked about microaggressions and common microaggressions that university students experience. And, there was a lot of kind of outrage, right?
Mhm.
And, we really want to have a couple of takeaways, practical tips for anyone who's connected in any way or interested in what DEI means on university campuses. And some of the takeaways from our previous topics still matter, right? What does diversity, equity, and inclusion actually mean for your university, for your university's mission and vision, for what you want to do and be for students? Who's your student body, right? How do you want to expand that? Who are your professors and what do they need to feel really equipped to create a deeper sense of inclusion in the classroom, and do that assessment first. That would be one of our first practical takeaways, because there is such a thing as bad DEI. Working at universities, I certainly have gotten kind of the press play. It's sort of like an airplane video, around the general concepts. There aren't any practical strategies for me as a faculty member, right, as a professor, and it doesn't feel relevant to anything that I'm doing. So that's for anybody. We want to make sure that our DEI initiatives are actually tied to the outcomes we want. One thing that I would recommend for any university interested in pursuing DEI, though, is professional development around inclusive pedagogies. I think there is a myth that in classrooms you are not allowed to have different ideas, and that there's sort of this kind of archetypal professor who is imposing liberal ideologies on students. Now, there's a lot underneath that, right? There's a lot of mythology underneath that. Statistically speaking, most students nationwide report that their professors don't really talk about their own politics in the classroom. That's actually not a thing that happens with the frequency that I think people think it does. But professors should feel prepared for conversations that come up in the classroom in a space where we are talking about the great questions of our world, which is ideally what's happening in institutions of higher learning. Great pedagogies will be designed for inclusivity, right? And every professor should be able to have structures put in place in their class that allow for disagreement, for robust debate, for vulnerable sharing, right? For conflict, harm, community accountability, and professional development around these skills will actually allow for the kind of place that we know young people deserve, because we are institutions of higher learning. And if you have, faculty members who are more researchers and scholars, we can't just assume that everyone knows how to do that, right? So my background is restorative justice. I'm teaching in my class. We have all sorts of things put in place so that we can have brave conversations. And it's actually quite the opposite of what I think the reputation is, which is that everyone needs a perfectly curated environment for their particular identities, and to not be offended, and that cancel culture is rampant. That's not what I see, and it's certainly not how I practice the science of teaching and learning. So how are we preparing professors for those spaces where maybe in the past it wasn't as necessary, but I can't imagine an institution of higher learning without those skills.
Yeah. I think in terms of, the protests that have been happening over the last year, and that continue to happen, also that have been happening over the last 60 years, like this is not new, right? So which leads me to a question that I want us to think about more as in higher education when we're thinking critically about protests that are happening on campus, which is identifying what skills are the young people using that we taught them, right? They're utilizing and leveraging skills and methodologies that they actually learned from us. What makes us proud to be, what about what they're doing actually makes us proud to be in service of them, right? It doesn't mean we agree with everything or disagree with everything, but the framing of that, framing in our work can have, I think, infinite impact, right? A reframing, a reimagining of how I think about this thing. How can I be proud of what they're doing and then take next steps from that place? And I think we talk a lot about True North EDI, just when is the inside not matching the outside, right? So in this case, I'm angry. I'm often angry or dismissive of the thought of disruption. I'm not including, obviously, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, right? The incidents of those happening, those are wrong, right? We a lot of our work is about addressing that kind of harm. What I'm talking about is the glossing over of kind of general disruption, general, not coming to class, occupying spaces. What about that is representative of what we taught them? And how are we showing up now if we are kind of not identifying the hypocrisy of that sometimes?
There's a beautiful quote by Salvador Allende, who the former president in Chile, who said, "To be a young person and not be a revolutionary is practically a biological contradiction." And I know that in the universities where I'm employed in visiting with students and speaking with them, I saw them participating in restorative justice circles. I saw them using participatory action research. I saw them as journalism scholars writing about what was happening in this moment in time on their university campus. I saw them engaging in town halls and open dialogues. I saw them utilizing nonviolent resistance tactics that we would have taught in any American history class, right? So I rarely, though, in any faculty meetings was hearing folks uplift some of the skills, knowledge, and general wisdom that young people have to offer us. And that doesn't mean that young people don't make mistakes. So I'm curious about what any university has in place as a structure similar to what we would want in our classrooms to help young people be accountable to one another, to heal, to make sure that everyone feels like they can grow into the person they're meant to be in this institution of learning. But we're in service of young people, I believe. And maybe that's just a personal philosophy, but I'm curious about how the hypocrisy of an organization, an institution that likely has less than 2% of its staff, tenured staff, representing Black women, potentially in a city that is majority folks of color, then expelling a student for an interpersonal act of harm or prejudice. The hypocrisy there is glaring, and I think it needs to be uplifted, that universities need to do better in seeing themselves as evolving institutions.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. So love to hear some questions in this area. Also, we kind of skipped the question section of the watering down language, so feel free to ask questions there as well. But there's a question here about there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that reported on a big drop in Black and Hispanic students enrolling in universities since affirmative action was removed. The question here is, how do we not get discouraged from this? And how can we point to this as a real impact from the anti-DEI movement? So the first thing is, in terms of how do we not get discouraged from this, we can. We actually can get discouraged. Like fear, discouragement is a state of being, and we have to relate to it as fleeting. Emotions and feelings, they come and they go. So we can feel what we feel, and then, this is Adrian Marie Brown say, transcend, right? So now what's next? What are we now inspired to do? What action are we inspired to take? What it doesn't mean, if it means we give up now, then I would say that there was a problem before the affirmative action was removed, right? That before that was an issue, if we're going to give up now, then something else is happening within us that we need to think about and grapple with. And in terms of, how do we point to this as an impact from the anti-DEI movement, I think that it definitely is in many cases. Enrollment statistics ebb and flow over years and decades. But I think when we can really point to a history and a trend that has now shifted it is not a far cry to say, oh, something big happened that can point to this. So all to say, we can point to the impact of an anti-DEI movement, point to the impact of the kind of erasure of a lot of affirmative action practices, but then we need to do something. For me, for years, no one told anyone, Fortune 500 companies, that they had to hire mostly white men into leadership positions. No one ever said they had to. There was no policy that said they had to. There was no legislation that said they had to. And yet somehow it managed to happen a lot. So we can look for ways to get the job done, find ways to get the job done, get creative in collectives around what we can do to get the job done, and then work on kind of initiating those actions, right? Regardless, you can call it a rutabaga, you can call it a schnoozedale. I don't really care what you call it, what you have to call it, particularly if you are at risk of losing funding, at risk of losing accreditation, right? There are real risks out here, but we don't stop working because we have to pivot. And that is, again, I think a byproduct of DEI is that we actually know how to pivot. We always have to, right? Question here.
There's a question in the chat or in the Q&A that says, any advice on how white leaders should speak about making changes to the DEI language definition that doesn't discourage staff of color?
Yes. Maybe I'm sure I'm reading this right. Any advice on how white leaders should speak about making changes to the DEI? I would say ask those people. Bring those people, bring people of color, bring, quite frankly, everyone who has a stake in it. And I think, Erin and I start with whoever in our organization is maybe representative of the most vulnerable, right? And even we find that out in relationships sometimes, but we bring those people into the conversation. I think the mistake here beyond DEI can be the inherited leadership value of, I have to be ready to speak in kind of this perfect way on behalf of the vision and mission of this organization, and hopefully I get it right. But that is an old playbook, right? Of course, we want inspiring leaders, we want leaders we want to follow, but the answer to the question here is in the question, right? How do you speak about it with folks of color? You make sure those folks of color are part of the speaking. It's right there. Erin, anything else from you about that?
Yeah, I would be really transparent about the thought process that took leaders to making the decision to make changes, because sometimes it's not visible to us. For example, we have worked with organizations that they're in a state that's facing anti-DEI legislation, and they've been forced to change, for example, mission statements, vision statements, right? DEI statements on their website, things like that. And they made those changes maybe without full transparency to the staff, and there was some uproar. But the changes were made because a loss of funding would mean an inevitable cut in jobs to the most vulnerable employees, who oftentimes are employees of color. So, and the folks who were most offended by the shift in the language were in many cases the least at risk, right? Socioeconomically speaking, positionally speaking within the organization, they held positions of power, more so in the organization. But because there was a lack of transparency around the thinking about why we needed to change the language, right? Ultimately, the reasoning being we need to protect the jobs and the livelihoods of the folks who work here and continue the mission, which is, in our belief, serving equity overall, that lack of transparency really left people at sea in terms of how they made sense of the kind of sudden shift, right? Which just on the surface looks like a sort of backing away, right? A weakening, a watering down. So if there's thought like that, right? Here are the risks that we assessed, starting from, as Cardozie said, starting from the positionality and the viewpoint of the most marginalized within the community, and how we make sure we center their safety, their economic safety, their socioeconomic safety, and how we center the equity work we're doing externally with our clients. It's now we've got more information to make sense of that, right? So again, transparency is, like we say at True North, right, is interpersonally it's honesty, and communally in an organization it's transparency. You know, be thoughtful and honest with your employees around why you're making the choices you're making.
Otherwise, I think you're running into paternalism.
100%.
And that's the thing, we want to avoid that, because it is another inheritance of a value system. Also, last thing I'll say about that is sometimes it's okay just to say, y'all, this sucks. Like, this sucks. But here's what we're thinking, and here's why we're thinking it, to your point, Erin, right? But it is not, for me, it is very impactful to hear the emotional impact and the social impact on leaders of organizations, right? Because obviously everyone feels it, but there is, again, an inheritance that leaders can't express that. And I think that some of that transparency comes through that sharing as well. Moving into, thank you so much, everyone. Moving into our final, kind of have about, let's see here, 11 minutes. And we'll get through this a little more quickly. We have no choice. But the hot topic that we're going to end on is there bad DEI? Right? Is there bad DEI? And I think it's important for us to like really like look at that question, because look at the topic, because it's a valid topic, right? A valid question. Many of you have been in DEI workshops, racial equity workshops, implicit bias workshops, whatever the topic is. You've been in that workshop before. You've had experiences that have been wonderful, especially if it's with us, or that did not end up feeling so good, that felt maybe less than effective, that felt maybe more divisive than it needed to. That exists all across every sector, right? Whether you're in education, or you are in medicine, or you are in psychotherapy, whatever the thing is. But the difference is, no one's saying we should get rid of medicine, because there's doctors who aren't that good at it, right? Or that we don't feel great about it at. Now, the thing about here is, bad is obviously subjective, right? And it's personal. A lot of the current backlash and a lot of the legislative language is about people feeling bad or feeling guilt or shame as the result of DEI work. Now, some places will say, no, it's about, the actions of like whoever's, facilitating the work. But there is language, particularly when Trump signed the executive order 4 years ago about DEI, that pretty much said, if you even feel bad or feel guilty, then that is a reason to shut this thing down, right? Effectively. But again, like any other skill sets, there's a spectrum of proficiency, right? And I think even more than, and I'm not looking to say, here's what proficiency looks like, right? What I am here to say is, let's look at actually the objectives of the work, and are we meeting the objectives of the work? Erin?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately we know that it depends on what your objectives are. And we have also published a few months ago a blog about how to partner with the right DEI consultant. I think that's really, really important, knowing what it is that you want to do, and how to do it exactly. And that's going to be important. We have a little guide for how you can make sure that you're partnering with a highly skilled consultant that's going to help you meet your needs and meet your goals, right? And do some of this work in a way that feels like, as we always say, right, it's not too heavy for everyone to carry, because it needs to get done, right? But we have the opportunity to evolve and grow, and this is that moment, right? We are in an evolving industry, like other fields, right? DEI does deserve the opportunity to grow and change. And that shouldn't necessarily happen right at the hands of those with the most power, but rather it's happening at the hands of folks doing the work who are committed to doing it no matter what, right? As we said before, we have not only been facilitating for about 10 years, we've also been in a lot of trainings, and we know one thing that we really loved was like when histories became uncovered, community and trust building, right? Skills, interpersonal skills, so necessary for having difficult conversations because tension exists in workplaces. And some of that aha moments, right? But there were also things that didn't work that I know we've moved away from, and maybe we would consider these some of those red flags. And Cardozie, do you want to talk about some of those?
Yeah, I think when we think about things like either we didn't love seeing, we didn't think it worked, or didn't align with what we thought the objectives were. I think we saw a lot of shocking videos and images, or like videos and images meant for shock value. When, obviously, depending on who you're trying to shock and teach through the shock, who's also there that has to feel the impact of that imagery, that has to feel the impact of that content. I think we saw a lot of positioning marginalized folks as like the spokesperson for their group, or we're looking at them to share their deepest, most painful stories with the groups, so that those with the most power, the most privilege, can understand just how terrible they are, or just how horrible the ism is, that they are a part of. And the headline there, it felt exploitative. And I think we saw, we did see facilitator tactics sometimes that were based in shame and guilt. And whether I'm in a session or not, or co-facilitating that does not feel good to me. And more importantly, I think that certainly guilt can create action. I'm concerned about the intention of the action from shame or guilt, right? Because now it's not about doing good, about rectifying harm, about creating equity. It's about, I need to do a thing so that I feel less bad. And I think that's a flawed approach to DEI, or at least not a sustainable one.
That's right.
So just a few kind of takeaways here, some tips for you all. And again, we'll share all of this in a kind of summary after the webinar. But we want to avoid the good bad paradigm. It's really reductive. It's really useful for those who are trying to shut down DEI. It's just bad, right? It's like most things, it's far more nuanced than that. Erin?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that we also want to do is really just make sure that we are assessing according to the objectives of the work, right? Of course, how you feel in a session is important, but we want to know the objectives of the DEI work, right? Again, what are the equity gaps that we are trying to close essentially, and assess against those objectives, rather than assessing against kind of how I'm necessarily feeling in a particular day, right? That's one thing that's really important, is that you have to have a framework for assessment of whether or not it's successful.
Yeah. And I think really interrogate kind of what is your critique coming from, right? Is it coming from, for me as a teacher, facilitator, theater person, I may be looking at a consultant or facilitator or a trainer like through those lenses and saying, oh, wow, I really would have done that differently. But we've seen a lot of people for whom their critique is coming from because they feel bad. Um, or someone that they want to speak on behalf of feels bad, right? So none of that's wrong, right? But where is it coming from? Because that helps us have create more responsive interventions to tend to it, to care for it, and to address it. Um,
We've got
so
like
that's
3 minutes.
yes, you have 3 minutes left. If there is a quick question or a question about this, love to see it here. While we do that, there's a question about how you work with True North EDI, and that's just by emailing us at info@truenorthedi.com. Um, we have a great team of people. It's post COVID has been an interesting time of virtual and remote hybrids. And or just kind of the spread has been interesting. But we can do all of that, both of those things. Um, and we take our advice, right? You talk to us to figure out if we are the right fit for you in terms of our value system, in terms of our background, in terms of the experience we have to offer. Erin, anything else?
No, I mean, I think unless there are any questions coming up for folks, um, we would love to, please email us. We love to continue the conversation. It's so fun for us to even just kind of bounce ideas around with you, the work that you're doing. We're interested in supporting how the landscape evolves and changes.
Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate you. We will be in touch for our next opportunity. And please follow us on LinkedIn. Enjoy your day, enjoy your week, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.